When a 62-year-old man was openly questioned about sitting in first class, he didn't shout or make a scene. But by the time the plane touched down, his calm reaction had spread all over the internet. And the airline was scrambling to fix the fallout. Raymond Jenkins didn't look like a man who needed to prove himself. He was 62, broad-shouldered, with silver streaks in his short hair and eyes that had witnessed more than they would ever tell. He walked through Gate C-12 at Phoenix Sky Harbor with the quiet confidence of a man who knew exactly who he was, and owed no explanations. He wore a navy linen blazer, crisp khakis, and leather shoes polished just enough to show he still had standards, even in retirement. In his right hand, he carried a worn leather-bound Langston Hughes poetry book. He took it everywhere. He said it reminded him of who he was and where he came from. In his left, a boarding pass that clearly said, C2A, first class, flight 349 to Seattle, was boarding right on time. Raymond had booked this trip for one simple reason: peace. After nearly 40 years as a school principal in Decatur, Georgia, this was a small gift to himself. No family, no duties, just a window seat, a cold drink, and poetry above the clouds. He greeted the flight attendant at the door with gentle, "How you doing?" and a warm smile that caught her by surprise. She smiled back, scanned his ticket, and pointed him to the front row. Raymond settled into his seat. The cushion felt firm, just right. He adjusted the overhead air vent, folded his blazer on his lap, and opened his book to a well-worn page. The cabin slowly filled up. Quiet chats, luggage being stowed, and the polite half-smile strangers share when they know they'll be stuck together for hours. Then Captain Blake Renault appeared, tall, tanned, and too impressed with himself. He was the kind of pilot who wore sunglasses indoors and called the crew kids. He strutted through first class like he owned not just the plane but the people on it. He nodded at familiar faces, slapped a man on the shoulder, and laughed at some inside joke with a flight engineer. Then he stopped, right at row 2, in front of Raymond. There was a short pause, but just long enough. "Sir," Renault said loudly, his voice dripping with condescension, "are you sure you're in the right seat?" Raymond didn't even blink. He calmly closed his book, held up his boarding pass, and said, "That's what it says." Renault looked at the pass, then at Raymond, then back at the seat. He forced a smile, but his eyes said something different. "Well, I guess they'll let anyone up here now," he muttered. It wasn't loud, but everyone nearby heard it. It wasn't just the words, it was the tone. Like someone like Raymond didn't belong in first class. A woman across the aisle shifted uncomfortably. She didn't say a word, but glanced at her husband, who had already started recording on his phone. Just instinct. Something about the captain's tone didn't sit right. Raymond didn't argue. He didn't flinch or get angry. He leaned back in his seat and quietly said, "I believe I've earned this seat just like everyone else." Renault smirked and muttered under his breath, "Sure you did," thinking no one heard. Then he walked off toward the cockpit. But the man with the phone caught every second, and that's when things began to change. At first, nobody spoke up. The engines hummed, safety announcements played, but the cabin felt different now. You could feel the tension in the air, subtle but heavy. Raymond went back to his book. The husband whispered to his wife, "I got all of that." She looked unsure. "You think we should post it?" He nodded. "People need to see that. It's not right." The plane hadn't even left the gate yet. But Captain Blake didn't know who Raymond really was, or how far this moment would reach. Raymond Jenkins didn't need approval from anyone on that plane. He'd earned every mile that got him to seat 2A, and thousands more. To understand why he didn't snap back at Renault, why he stayed calm, you'd have to know where he came from, and what he'd survived already. He grew up in Monroe, Louisiana, in a small house on a quiet street with patchy grass and a front porch that leaned slightly to the left. His father, Jerome Jenkins, was a school janitor and one of the smartest men Raymond ever knew. Jerome never finished 8th grade, but could fix anything, quote Baldwin from memory, and taught Raymond more about self-worth than any textbook ever could. Jerome always told him, "Don't let another man's assumptions about you become your truth. Most people don't even know themselves, let alone you. Raymond carried that lesson into every room he ever walked into: classrooms, staff meetings, superintendent reviews, PTA nights where some parents couldn't hide their surprise that he was a principal. He was always polite, always sharp, always ready. Not because he had something to prove, but because he refused to give anyone a reason to doubt him. People always found excuses to treat him as if he was less. He started teaching English at 23 and became a principal by 35. Over the years, he mentored kids who grew up to be lawyers, chefs, electricians, and soldiers. Kids who came back later, shook his hand with tears in their eyes, and never forgot how he made them feel truly seen. But even with all the lives he changed, there were moments that stung. The store clerk who tailed him down aisles, pretending to tidy shelves. The woman who clutched her purse tighter when he walked by at a bus stop. The car salesman who assumed he was lost when he stepped into the showroom. Raymond never yelled, never cursed. He just asked questions in that calm, steady voice of his. Did I do something to make you think that? Would you say that to someone else? Or does it bother you that I don't fit your idea of who should be here? He didn't need to raise his voice. He just raised the standard. So when Captain Blake Renault made that comment, it wasn't new. It was just another version of what Raymond had faced all his life. This time wrapped in a pilot's uniform, delivered with a smug grin, but no different underneath. He had taught his students how to read between the lines, how words weren't always a real message. Tone mattered. Looks mattered. What wasn't said could scream louder than what was. That moment in first class wasn't about a seat. It was about presence, permission, about who gets to sit somewhere without being questioned. Raymond knew that. He also knew the power of silence, letting the moment breathe, making the other person feel the weight of their own ignorance. But what Captain Renault didn't know, and what no one else on that plane yet realized, was that Raymond had spent a lifetime turning moments like that into lessons. Not just for kids, but for anyone who crossed a line and thought they'd get away with it. And this time, Raymond wasn't alone on that flight. Across the aisle, the man who filmed it, Brian Lattimore, had already started uploading the clip before takeoff. No caption, just a quote, "Sure you did, Captain." Flight 349. By the time the wheels lifted off the ground, the video was bouncing around Reddit and TikTok, racking up thousands of views within minutes. The algorithm loved tension, and nothing better than arrogance caught on camera. Raymond sat there, eyes on his book, unaware. He read the same stanza 3 times without realizing it. Something stirred in his chest, but it wasn't anger or shame. It wasn't about him. And someone else was handling it for him, while the whole world watched. Flight 349 was halfway to Seattle when the ripple turned into a wave. A 22-second video, a little grainy but clear, spread across timelines. Brian hadn't really planned to post it, but the way the pilot spoke, as if Raymond had wandered where he didn't belong, didn't sit right with him. When he replayed the clip, he heard it again, those 6 words. "Well, I suppose they're letting anyone up here now." It wasn't just smug. It was heavy with quiet disrespect that men like Raymond had endured all their lives. But this time, the camera didn't blink. It caught the look, the smirk, and even the chuckle from the flight attendant walking behind Renault. Almost on cue, by the time the flight attendant served drinks, the video had hit 10,000 views. By the time the snack cart rolled down the aisle, it was at 100,000. Raymond still didn't know. He thanked the attendant with a soft smile and took his ginger ale, finally reading a page without losing his place. Outside the window, the sun dipped behind a layer of clouds. Inside, a digital storm was already swirling. On the ground, hashtag popped up, hashtag Flight 349, hashtag Raymond Jenkins. Someone had found his name through the passenger list and matched it to a retired principal mentioned in a local education article. A Facebook photo of him in a cap and gown beside 3 graduates spread on X with a caption, "This is the man that pilot tried to humiliate. He taught our kids. He deserves better." Replies flooded in, some angry, some embarrassed with the airline, some sharing the post silently. By the time the plane reached cruising altitude, a petition was live demanding an investigation into the airline. And still, Raymond quietly turned the pages of his poetry book, unaware of the storm below. Up in the cockpit, Blake Renault was just as clueless. He'd flown hundreds of routes, made thousands of calls, and dodged more than one complaint in his career. He knew how to cover his tracks and talk his way out of trouble. But this wasn't 1998. This wasn't behind a closed door or hidden in a paper file. This was the internet. And the internet doesn't forget. Meanwhile, Brian turned to his wife and whispered, "It's blowing up." She leaned over, peeked at his phone. "Oh my God. Do we tell him?" he asked. She looked over at Raymond, who was calmly sipping his drink and jotting notes in the margin of his poetry book. "I don't think he even knows," she said. They waited. Maybe they didn't want to disturb him. Maybe they were afraid it would ruin his peace. Or maybe they just didn't know how you even tell someone their dignity is trending online. In seat 4C, a teenager with pink headphones tapped his mom's arm and showed her the clip. She gasped, looked at the cockpit door, then back at the screen. People began shifting in their seats. There was no shouting, no drama, just quiet stares, silent judgment, and a new awareness of the man in seat 2A and the man behind the cockpit door. The flight attendants noticed too. One leaned in and whispered to another, "Did you see it?" She nodded slowly. "Yeah, it's bad." It didn't take long for a message to reach headquarters. Then another. The airline's PR team heard, about around 4:32 p.m. By 4:45, an emergency meeting was already on the calendar. People started covering their tracks, checking employee files, pulling up old complaints. Meanwhile, Raymond just leaned back, eyes closed, remembering a poem he once recited to students. "I, too, sing America." He felt the irony. He knew the weight of it. He didn't need pity. He just wanted to land. But by the time he stepped off that plane, the ground beneath Captain Blake's career was already cracking. Flight 349 touched down at Seattle-Tacoma International just before 6 p.m. The plane rolled along the runway as passengers grabbed phones, bags, and jackets, the usual routine. But in the front rows, there was an unusual stillness, an unspoken awareness that something had changed. Raymond Jenkins stood, stretched his legs, and adjusted his blazer. As he reached for his carry-on, a gentle voice stopped him. "Sir," Brian said from across the aisle, "before you go, there's something I think you should know." Raymond turned, calm as ever. Brian held out his phone. The screen showed Raymond's face frozen mid-sentence, next to the words, "letting anyone up here now." Raymond's brows drew together. He didn't speak. "It's gone viral," Brian explained. "People are talking. A lot." Raymond looked at the screen, then at Brian. "You recorded it?" "I did. I didn't mean to post it at first, but it felt wrong to let it slide." There was a long pause. Then Raymond simply said, "Thank you." No anger, no tension, just quiet gratitude. By the time Raymond walked off that plane, his name was being mentioned on national radio. Within half an hour, a major news network aired a short segment showing the clip. Analysts broke down the pilot's words frame by frame. Legal experts debated on live TV. Microaggression, one said. Unprofessional and unacceptable, said another. The airline social media team scrambled to put out a bland, careful statement. "We are aware of a situation that occurred aboard Flight 349 and are conducting an internal review." It didn't help. By 9 p.m., screenshots of old posts surfaced. An anonymous flight attendant leaked a past complaint filed against Captain Blake Renault 2 years earlier. Different flight, same attitude. The passenger had described feeling talked down to and mocked. Staff whispers started circulating too. Renault's been like this for years. Arrogant, untouchable. We all knew. An employee posted that anonymously. It was falling apart fast. The airline's PR team pushed out a follow-up statement, promising accountability. But it was too late. Comment sections filled up with stories from other passengers. Tales of subtle digs, of being asked for ID in first class when others weren't, of being watched and questioned. And then, late that night, a second video leaked. A retired flight attendant had saved an old voicemail Renault left her after a dispute about crew assignments. His voice clear, mocking, unfiltered. "You can cry to HR all you want. They'll side with me. They always do." That sealed it. By morning, hashtags had turned into headlines. veteran pilot under fire after viral video sparks backlash. Who is Raymond Jenkins? Retired educator at the center of viral first-class incident. And somewhere in a modest hotel room just outside the airport, Raymond sat with a cup of black coffee and his phone buzzing every few minutes. Calls from reporters, messages from old students, emails from strangers thanking him. He didn't answer most of them. He wasn't interested in becoming any one symbol. But what caught him by surprise was the airline statement at 10:43 a.m. Captain Renault has been placed on administrative leave pending further investigation. It didn't feel like justice, not yet, but it was something, a first crack in a wall that had stood too long. Raymond finally answered one call. It was a young woman who said, "You don't know me, but you were my principal back in 2007. I just want to say thank you for staying calm, for not letting that moment make you bitter. You taught us that, and now the whole world is seeing it." He smiled, not a big grin, just a quiet, knowing smile. "I'm just glad someone was paying attention," he said. Because that's what mattered, not the punishment, not the headlines, but that someone noticed. But no one expected what Raymond would say next, or how it would shake the entire industry. Raymond never chased the spotlight. But when the requests kept pouring in, one name stood out: Denise Corbin, a respected journalist from Seattle known for real stories, not viral noise. She didn't want a soundbite. She wanted the truth. They met at a local community center 2 days after the flight. No lights, no stage, just 2 chairs in an empty gym, a single camera, and the hum of the heating unit kicking on and off. Denise started gently. "Mr. Jenkins, when you boarded Flight 349, did you ever imagine we'd be sitting here talking about it on camera?" Raymond smiled politely. "I imagine a cold drink, maybe a nap. That's about it." She chuckled. "When the pilot questioned you, what went through your mind?" Raymond paused, choosing his words. "I've been asked if I belong in a lot of rooms in my life. That one just had wings." Denise blinked, then nodded slowly. "You didn't react with anger." "Why?" "Because I wasn't surprised," Raymond said. "And because I wasn't there to make a scene. I was there to rest. To sit in a seat I paid for fair and square. And no one's disbelief ever changed my truth." A clip of that quote went viral within hours. 1 million people watched it, and something shifted. It wasn't outrage anymore. It was respect. Respect for a man who could have fought fire with fire, but chose patience instead. Raymond never accused anyone by name. He didn't call for a boycott. He didn't shout. He just talked about dignity, about what it means to sit where some people don't expect you to be, and stay seated anyway. "I used to tell my students," he said, "you can't control how someone sees you, but you can control how you see yourself. That's the battle." He shared small stories. Times he'd been mistaken for the janitor when he was actually the principal. Times he'd been ignored in meetings until someone realized he was the one in charge. He wasn't bitter. Maybe tired, but never broken. And the public heard him. People started speaking out. Not just online, but on camera. Former passengers, crew members, airline staff who had seen the same behavior from Blake Renault. The pattern was too clear to deny. Then came the whistleblower, a former pilot from the same airline, interviewed anonymously. He described a culture where complaint about senior captains quietly vanished or were handled behind closed doors. He said, "This incident with Mr. Jenkins only went public because someone had the courage to hit record." The airline issued a longer statement, this time with words like inclusivity, accountability, and commitment to a better future. But they still didn't say Blake's name. When asked if he felt satisfied, Raymond shook his head. "Satisfaction's not what I'm after. I just want systems to learn. I want the next man sitting in seat 2A to sip his drink and read his book without being questioned." That's when everything changed. Within days, the airline announced an internal audit of conduct policies across all domestic flights. Training programs were restructured. Language and sensitivity workshops became mandatory for everyone, from gate agents to captains. And then the unexpected happened. The airline renamed the internal conduct policy under a new title, the Jenkins Code. Raymond wasn't thrilled about the name. "I didn't write any code," he said. "I just sat down." But he understood the point. It wasn't about a policy. It was about setting a new baseline. Respect was no longer optional. The final blow came when Blake Renault's contract was officially terminated. Quietly, of course. No headlines, no cameras at the gate. Just an internal notice confirming his departure. Some said it wasn't enough. Raymond never commented on the firing. He simply thanked Denise for giving him space to speak, then stood up, buttoned his jacket, and said, "Now, if you'll excuse me, I've got grandkids waiting for me." While the headlines focused on Blake, the real story was still a man in seat 2A. Raymond Jenkins didn't return home to a cheering crowd or reporters waiting on his lawn. He went home to his modest one-story house in Decatur, where the hedges were trimmed just right, and the porch swing still creaked the same way it had since his wife picked it out back in '92. Inside, the walls were lined with framed photos, students shaking his hand, teachers he'd mentored, his daughters in graduation gowns, and his late wife Gloria smiling from their 25th anniversary trip to Savannah. He dropped his bag by the door, hung his blazer on the coat rack, and settled into his favorite recliner, the same one he used to grade papers in long after everyone else had gone to bed. His phone buzzed every few minutes with new messages and mentions. He ignored them, not out of pride, but because he needed to hear something else for a while. He turned on the jazz station, let Coltrane fill the room, and leaned back with a sigh. That evening, his youngest granddaughter, Ava, climbed onto his lap, 8 years old, full of questions. "Grandpa," she said, "Mommy said you're on the news." He chuckled. "I suppose I was. Did you do something bad?" "No, baby. I just sat down." She thought about that for a moment. But why were people mad? Raymond paused. Because some folks don't expect certain people to be in certain places. And when they see them there, they get uncomfortable. She frowned. "That's silly." He smiled. "It is, but it's been happening a long time." Then she said something that stuck with him. "You didn't yell. You just stayed sitting. That's cool." Raymond kissed her forehead. Sometimes staying still is the loudest thing you can do. In the weeks that followed, the attention faded. The hashtags moved on, but the changes stayed. The airline kept the Jenkins code. Other airlines quietly adopted similar rules. Once a month, Raymond received a letter, always from someone new. A young teacher, a retired veteran, a college student who'd seen the video and realized they didn't have to stay silent the next time someone questioned their place. He never posted about it. He never gave big speeches. He just wrote back a short note and added a handwritten quote. "You are enough. Let them adjust." Raymond never needed to be a symbol. He didn't want to be anyone's cause. But through one calm response and decades of quiet strength, he proved that character speaks loudest when you don't need to shout. In a world obsessed with clapbacks and takedowns, he reminded people that not every battle is won by force. Sometimes it's a stillness, the dignity, the unshakable calm in the face of disrespect that changes things. Not the video, not the headlines, but the man in seat 2A, the one who'd been overlooked 100 times before and chose not to let it make him bitter. He just sat and waited for the world to catch up. So here's the lesson. If someone questions where you belong, don't give them the satisfaction of shrinking. Sit tall. Speak when it matters. And remember, your presence alone can challenge their assumptions more than any argument ever could. And if this story meant something to you, share it. Not for clicks, but for the next person sitting in a seat they were told they didn't deserve. And if you haven't yet, subscribe for more stories that matter. Real people, real moments, and the truths that connect us all.